When Sauk War Chief Black Hawk surrendered, he may have expected death, but after a brief time of imprisonment, he was given a tour of East Coast cities. Black Hawk found himself treated as a celebrity, making public appearances, signing autographs, and given tours of military installations. This continued a practice from the time of Thomas Jefferson, impressing on Indian leaders the need to accept the will of the United States. The tour included theatrical performances, musical concerts, and a shopping trip to New York City stores. While Black Hawk was treated as a celebrity back east, he was hung in effigy by angry crowds in Detroit on his return trip. Just as the United States were divided in their reactions to Black Hawk, Indian nations were divided in how to respond to the land-grabbing expansion of the United States.
Oh, we are way, oh, we are, oh, we are, oh, we are.
The struggle between Europeans and Native Americans is characterized by cruel, violent, and savage behavior on both sides of the conflict. Non-combatants, including children, were sometimes fatal and intentional victims in the numerous wars that were carried on. At Fort Mims, Red Stick Creek Indians killed women and children, sparing only African slaves. At Jamestown, the attack did not spare non-combatants, and at Amont's Cabin, women and children were killed and mutilated by Black Hawk's band. Settlers and the Army killed non-combatants in attacks on Indian villages. It should also be noted that when Native American villages were burned and their food supplies destroyed, children died of hunger and exposure. At the Battle of Bad Axe, women and children trying to swim across the Mississippi River were targeted and killed by gunfire by the U.S. Army. Neither side had a monopoly on killing non-combatants. In many battles, women and children were captured, seen as important leverage in negotiations. There were also many times when captives were treated with kindness and considered part of the band or tribe. Some women captives were fully integrated into tribal life, and they noted how Indian women yielded more power than the society from which they were taken. For many groups, women controlled the housing and the food supply, and their decisions could have a major impact on a spouse or even on the whole tribe. Early colonists discovered that children had a special place in relations between Euro-Americans and indigenous groups. Since children were non-threatening, they sometimes served as emissaries to smooth out minor conflicts and misunderstandings. While captives provided leverage in negotiations, their return did not always result in peace. The end of hostilities often meant the return to colonists of captured children. This was a time of strong emotions for everyone. Captured children often bonded with their captors, forming familiar bonds with the Indians with which they lived. It was hard on these surrogate parents to part with the child. It was also difficult on the colonial parents to see the reluctance of their child to return. In some cases, the children ran away back to the Native American community with which they felt more comfortable. Even in the cruelest of times, though, acts of unexpected kindness occurred. During the removal to Indian country, white people on farms and in small towns responded to the suffering of the exiles by giving them food and blankets. Mandy Yepaw learned that her Cherokee ancestor was cared for by a white family during the deadly migration to Indian country.
My Cherokee ancestor actually is a survivor of the Trail of Tears. His name is John Mahi, and I believe he's I think it's like 4 great grandfather. And he was on the Trail of Tears with his family. They came from, who knows, somewhere probably around Virginia or Florida or somewhere in there. And then they marched all the way to Missouri. And on that way, his whole family died. And he was only 7 years old when he arrived in Missouri, all by himself. I mean, with the other Cherokee tribe on the Trail of Tears, but his immediate family was all gone, his mother and father and any siblings that he had. So he was adopted into a white family, the Thompsons, and Missouri adopted him and raised him. And he went on to fight in the Civil War. And he was injured in the Civil War. He walked with a limp after that. And then he was also, being in Missouri, he was a musician. And he actually is kind of famous because he invented his own bluegrass instrument, which is, there's something called a dulcimer, which is a bluegrass instrument. And he invented one called the walking cane dulcimer, which is like a little bit longer. And because he also used it as a walking cane because he had this injury.
Removal and the events leading to it caused deep divisions among the Cherokee. Major Ridge, convinced that removal was inevitable, signed the Treaty of New Echota in 1835. The treaty gave up more of the shrinking Cherokee land. Selling Cherokee land was considered a blood crime, and in 1839 Major Ridge and other signers were killed by supporters of Chief John Ross. The executions were followed by revenge killings, and the Cherokee Civil War raged on for over a decade. Some Cherokees escaped removal by hiding in the mountains of North Carolina. They became the separate Eastern Band and did not interact with the other bands for many years. Separations of the upper and lower creeks endured, as did those of the Sauk, the Potawatomi, and other tribes. Some separations were simply geographic in nature. The Shawnee, who moved to Texas, were known to the rest of the tribe as the Absentee Band. Historians call it the Shoshonean expansion, the entrance onto the Great Plains by a band who became known later as the Comanche. The Great Plains offered a seemingly endless supply of bison, but the Comanche also sought horses. At one time, most horses finding themselves on the market at St. Louis was supplied by Comanche bands through their trading partners. The Comanches also sought dominance on the southern plains, and they achieved this through hunting, trading, raiding, and warfare. The Comanches were among the first to adapt to horses, and they became masters at using horses for hunting bison and warfare. By the 1830s, the Comanches were cut off from ties to their Shoshone relatives by Cheyenne and Arapaho interlopers. The Comanches formed into independent bands with family connections. There was no central authority over those bands. There also were no peace chiefs. These bands were led by war chiefs. Also, in contrast to many Native American groups, the Comanche were patriarchal rather than matrilineal. They made fairly quick work of pushing most Apaches to the west of Texas, forming bonds with groups that suffered under Apache aggression. One such group was the Wichita, who became a major trade partner of the Comanches. Efforts by Spanish authorities to make peace with the Comanches were largely unsuccessful. Spanish missionaries and early settlers suffered frequent raids for horses and firearms and captives to become slaves. When Mexico became independent, Comanche raids continued. Mexican authorities struggled with finding some way of controlling the Comanches. Some Native American groups fleeing aggression in the East were welcome to settle in Texas, but they provided little protection from the violence of the Comanches. The Great Plains of North America was the destination of numerous surrounding Indian tribes. The great herds of buffalo and other game were magnets for people seeking greater wealth and escaping aggression. From the west, the Comanches, the Utes, and the Shoshone descended from the Rocky Mountains. From the north, the Plains Cree and the Blackfoot expanded. From the east, a number of tribes had been pushed west by European rivalries and the United States. Many of these groups had once lived in the Ohio Valley and in the Great Lakes region, trading woodland economies and cultures for those of the Great Plains. One of these Great Lake groups was the Cheyenne. They had once lived in what is now Minnesota, where they were close allies with the Arapaho and had mostly friendly relations with the Sioux. Since the Ojibwa had obtained guns from the French before the Cheyenne had, the Ojibwa were able to push them across the Missouri River into North and South Dakota. This is where the Cheyennes developed the horse culture. They expanded into the Black Hills and the Powder River Basin. This is where they introduced horses to the Sioux. After a time, the Lakota Sioux pushed the Cheyenne out of the Black Hills. The Kiowa once inhabited the heart of the Great Plains. They were positioned in the center, an ideal location to profit from the Great Plains trading network. But they were no match for the Cheyenne expansion into this region, which pushed the Kiowa south. With the help of the Arapaho, the Cheyenne came to control an extensive territory. There were 10 bands of the Cheyenne, and some of those bands continued south to the Cimarron River and formed friendly trade at Bent's Fort. Making friends with Charles Bent, these bands moved further south, staying in the area, hence becoming the Southern Cheyenne. They maintained regular contact with the rest of the tribe in the northern plains. The Sun Dance brought all the bands together for fellowship, forgiveness, healing, and spiritual renewal. It was an event very important to the Cheyenne people. This ritualized dance went on for days and strengthened bonds between the various bands. So those in the South never lost their relations with the bands in the North. For the Southern Cheyenne, their presence in the South did not go unchallenged. The Cheyenne and the Arapaho fought the allied Comanche, Kiowa, and Plains Apache. The battle at the Washita River was only one of many, resulting in heavy losses on both sides. In 1840, they all made an alliance with each other, allowing the Cheyenne to hunt on the Llano Estacado, and later to join the Kiowa in raids into Mexico. This proved disastrous, as all but 3 Cheyenne were killed by well-prepared Mexican troops. The Cheyenne in the north made an alliance with the Lakota Sioux, expanding their territory there. The Cheyenne escaped the smallpox epidemic sweeping the northern plains by fleeing to the mountains, but the cholera epidemic in 1849 killed many Cheyenne. The Cheyenne were often in battles against their main enemies, including the Crow, the Blackfoot, Shoshone, Flathead, Nez Perce, and others. They also fought the Osage, the Pawnee, Wichita, and Apache bands as they probed into those territories on hunting and trading ventures. In 1851, the Cheyenne signed a treaty with the United States at Fort Laramie. The Indian agents recognized most of the territory controlled by the Cheyenne. In agreeing not to attack immigrants on the Oregon Trail, the Cheyenne were provided some cash and supplies from the United States. They agreed to allow passage through their country and the building of forts by the U.S. Army. In 1856, after an incident that wounded a Cheyenne warrior, Indians attacked an immigrant party near Fort Kearny. The United States sent a punitive expedition of 400 soldiers after the Cheyenne, resulting in the first battle between the Cheyenne and the United States Army. The Cheyenne drew their spiritual strength through sacred objects. They went into battle with sacred medicine arrows, which were captured once by an enemy, causing the warriors to retreat. The Cheyenne were also keepers of the sacred buffalo hat. The Oregon Trail had a major impact on Native Americans in the West. The trail stretched from Independence, Missouri to the Willamette Valley in Oregon, crossing the lands of various Native American tribes on the Great Plains, the Intermountain West, and the Columbia River Basin. By the 1830s, the beaver fur trade began to decline, following the fall from fashion of felt hats made from beaver fur. The Hudson Bay Company competed with the fur trade by trappers in the United States. Those trappers exchanged goods at gatherings in various locations in the West. This competition spurred the Hudson Bay Company to establish trading posts along the York Express, ending in Oregon country with Fort Vancouver operating along the Columbia River. The Oregon country was jointly claimed by England and the United States. Traders fanned out widely from England's Fort Vancouver. The head of the fort, Chief Factor John McLaughlin, supervised the trade that passed through the fort. McLaughlin maintained good relations with Native Americans in the Pacific Northwest. Cannons were never fired in anger at Native Americans. As chief factor, John McLaughlin looked after the interest of the company and of England. Now, part of his mission was to discourage settlement by people from the United States. But the immigrants had strong motivation to come to Oregon. Free land was their reward, the promise of a good life. The journey was nonetheless grueling, and immigrants arrived destitute after the long, exhausting journey. Many left home back east with the stated desire to run the English out of Oregon country, but most would not have survived to do so without the help of John McLaughlin. He provided medical services, seeds, food, and farm implements on credit, giving them a chance to establish themselves on land they received from the United States government, land that belonged to the Native Americans. The Oregon Trail immigrants would also have failed had it not been for support from various groups of Native Americans along the trail. Food was replenished through trade with Native Americans. Dangerous river crossings were made safer with help from Indians. And passage down the wild, thunderous Columbia River was carried out with help from Native Americans. Unlike most of the immigrants, most Indians could swim, and Native American boys made the river passage possible at risk to themselves. Passage across Indian land was arranged with the Cheyenne and other indigenous groups through treaties. And although immigrants feared attacks by Native Americans, such attacks were rare. Far more pioneers died of disease and self-inflicted gunshots than from Native American arrows. In 1842, the traffic on the Oregon Trail increased to 100 people. At Fort Hall in Idaho, many left their wagons and traveled the rest of the way by water on the Snake and Columbia rivers. The trek of 100 people across the Great Plains and the mountains caused few problems for Native Americans along the trail. A crisis developed, though, in 1843 when 1,000 wagons headed west. This was known as the Great Migration of 1843. Immigrants encountered bison and killed them for meat, and only meat, wasting the rest of the carcass. They hunted other animals as well, causing a shortage of food for the Native Americans in whose territory they passed. Even worse, they spread disease for which the Indians had no immunity. Along with traders, immigrants spread smallpox one year and cholera the next years. Some travelers lived long enough to get medical help at Whitman Mission from Dr. Marcos and his wife Narcissa. Some lived long enough for medical help from Dr. John McLaughlin at Fort Vancouver. Many died before they could get help, but there was no hope for most Native Americans who contracted those diseases. They died in droves. The immigrant trail also cut off transportation by Native Americans, with lines of wagons stretching to the horizon. Many who tried crossing the trail at night were shot, suspected of trying to attack the immigrants. There were raids on immigrants for horses and for food supplies when local people became desperate. Raids were frequently followed by punitive army action, sometimes against indigenous groups who had not participated in the raids. Some Oregon Trail migrants went to California instead of the Pacific Northwest, especially when California changed hands from Mexico to the United States. The fur trade had resulted in a chain of Russian forts along the Pacific coast. Fort Ross in California was sold to James Sutter, who enslaved indigenous people for labor. A white worker, James Marshall, was excavating for a mill when he discovered gold in 1848. Attempts to keep the find secret failed, and soon word of California gold spread all the way to the East Coast. People came from all over the world to stake claims and work them. This greatly increased traffic on the Oregon-California Trail. Then that brought with it more problems for Native Americans, in whose territory the trail passed. The United States attempted to avert further hostilities in the 1851 Treaty of Fort Laramie. The Cheyenne, the Sioux, and many other tribes attended. The Treaty Council established territories for the tribes, which they promised to respect. They agreed that immigrants would stay on the trail and not fan out to hunt. The tribes agreed to allow immigrants safe passage, agreeing not to raid nor attack the travelers. They also agreed to allow construction of forts along the trail. The Cheyenne had most of their territory left intact, and some others agreed to move to reservations. Forts arose along the trail, though only some were military. Fort Bridger and Fort Hall, for example, were mostly trading posts. While indispensable for resupply in food and other necessities, many of the trade items were supplied by Native Americans. As trail traffic increased, the nature of the Oregon-California Trail changed, with less dependence on friendly Native Americans. An overland trail was established around Mount Hood, avoiding dangerous passage on the Columbia River. The pioneer Applegate family established a trail approaching Oregon from the south, a trail that passed through the land of the Modoc people in Northern California. Added to this was the Mormon migration to the desert of Utah. The Mormons pushed handcarts along the trail, taking the opposite bank of the Platte River and then pushing south to Utah Territory. The Mormons established ferries across key river crossings, expediting travel for all trail users. For Euro-Americans, the Oregon Trail established a national narrative of brave, rugged pioneers venturing into the West to expand the country to the West Coast. Landmarks along the trail became national symbols. Independence, Missouri, the jumping-off place. Scotts Bluff. Chimney Rock was a major trail marker in today's Nebraska. Independence Rock, where the 4th of July was celebrated and immigrants carved their names. After seemingly endless days crossing the prairie, the Rocky Mountains provided a measure of psychological relief, but then gave them challenging barriers. The countless river crossings and the wonders they found along the Snake River, the storms and the great herds of buffalo, the struggle through the Blue Mountains in Oregon. All these had their place in the narrative of Western movement and manifest destiny. Fear of Native Americans is part of that narrative, and there were some horrible attacks, but this left a false impression. Those attacks were very rare. The circling of wagons at night to contain livestock became a symbol of defense against hostile Indians.
The Indians out here on the prairies were a great assistance to the pilgrims going west. The Indians had things that the pilgrims really needed. They had some food, they had clothing and things like this, leather, buckskin, moccasins. And the pilgrims, of course, they had things the Indians wanted: colored cloth, whiskey, tobacco, gunpowder, sugar, coffee, things like this. So there was a lot of trading going on out here.
Some of that trading took place at the forts that lined the trail, places where Native Americans found a willing market for their trade goods. Fort Laramie was the main military fort, a place from which soldiers could quickly respond to trouble. There were also much-needed services such as blacksmithing and non-Indian trade items. Eventually, there was the end of the trail, the Willamette Valley, and Oregon City. The floating of wagons on the turbulent Columbia River, Mount Hood soaring in the background, and the settlement of fertile land, all these etched the Oregon Trail in the minds of Americans of national glory. As indelible as the ruts carved into bedrock, this migration, in all its heroism, leaves a mark on the national narrative of the United States. This experience for Native Americans was seen much differently. The same diseases that killed so many immigrants were fatal to uncounted indigenous people along the trail. The decimation of their hunting grounds meant hunger and starvation for their families. At trail's end, the homeland of Native Americans in the Willamette Valley and beyond were forcefully taken, leaving those people destitute. The immigration problem faced by Texas stands out in its proportions. Immigrants flood over the border, some without permission. Texas culture is overtaken by their numbers, and respect for authority seems lacking. The immigrants bring a strange language and overwhelm those already living there. This is not the border of the Troubles. It's this border, the Sabine River bordering Louisiana. It's not 2021, but the mid-1800s, and the immigrants are from the United States, entering Mexico. Stephen Austin brought United States settlers to Mexico's Texas region with permission from Mexico. Those settlers were farmers, and they agreed to become Catholics, and since Mexico did not allow slavery, they would not bring African slaves into Texas. Mexico's claim to Texas stemmed from its inclusion by New Spain before Mexican independence. The border with Louisiana was set by Spain in the Adams-Onis Treaty with the United States. In allowing immigrants from the United States, the Mexican government was hoping for a buffer between Mexico and the region controlled by the Comanches. After a time, this wasn't going well. Immigrants arrived with African slaves, and they had no intentions of joining the Catholic Church. Many in those days entered without permission. They were illegal immigrants. Mexico's leader Oleo Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna imprisoned Austin in Mexico City when Austin lobbied for greater Texas autonomy. Austin later returned to Texas and advised Texans to prepare for war. War did come to Texas, with Santa Anna arriving with thousands of Mexican troops. Texas claimed independence and appointed Sam Houston to lead the rebels against Santa Anna's army. Not long after the defeat at the old mission called the Alamo, the Texas rebels defeated Santa Anna at the Battle of San Jacinto. Santa Anna surrendered and agreed to take his sorry self and his soldiers back to Mexico. And so was born the Republic of Texas, the Lone Star Republic. The Texas Republic ranged from the Red River in the north to the Nueces River in the south and west past San Antonio. This included Comancheria, although the Comanches had no voice in this claim. Sam Houston advised dealing peacefully and fairly with the Comanches and other Native American tribes. The Texas Assembly chose violence instead, forming the Texas Rangers to attack the tribes, as well as former Mexicans who fought on the side of Texans against Santa Anna. Mexico had other rebellious areas, including the Yucatan Peninsula. As the Texas Republic urged the United States to admit it to the Union, Mexico continued to include territory west of Texas, stretching to California. News of Houston's victory over Santa Anna moved quickly, and more Americans began dreaming of owning cotton plantations in Texas, using slave labor. Sam Houston had friends among the Cherokee and spent time with them, usually when drinking. He appealed to the other leaders of Texas to coexist with the Indian tribes there, but coexistence was not wanted. The Texas Republic would no longer host some of the Native Americans that had been welcomed by New Spain and Mexico, to be a buffer between Euro-Americans and the Comanches and what was left of the Apaches. The absentee band of the Shawnee people were told they had to leave, but the government at least paid them for the improvements they made on their land. The Republic of Texas was eager to become a state, but America's original sin made that doubtful. Since 1619, when African slaves arrived at Jamestown, slave labor from Africa was a divisive struggle of the English colonies and later the United States. Some states ended slavery as soon as the country began, but the economy of the southern states depended on slave labor. Mexico's constitution prohibited slavery, but it proved tenacious in the South. So when Texas wanted to become a state, Congress was divided over the issue, with free states afraid of becoming overwhelmed by slave states. So Texas was told no. At least until James K. Polk was elected president. When Texas was admitted as a state, Mexico broke diplomatic relations. There was also disagreement over the border. The United States insisted it was the Rio Grande River. Mexico only recognized the Nueces River. President Polk sent General Zachary Taylor to Texas to provoke war with Mexico, which he did. There were numerous battles with many soldiers killed on both sides. Known in the United States as the War with Mexico, the U.S. Army pushed south into Mexico, meeting spirited resistance from the Mexican Army. Meanwhile, General Scott invaded Mexico from the sea, landing at Veracruz and mirroring the route that Hernán Cortés took to Tenochtitlan in 1519. Military careers were launched here, including that of a young officer, Ulysses S. Grant. Mexican Army cadets at Chapultepec Academy saw military resistance melt and jumped to their deaths from the Chapultepec Castle rather than suffer the dishonor of being taken prisoner. They are honored today as the Niños Héroes, the boy heroes in Mexico City, which fell to the forces of the United States. The war was ended with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, wherein Mexico sold much of the American Southwest to the United States. That war took many lives and caused division among troops from the U.S. Irish soldiers, recent immigrants who were Roman Catholics, found their Mexican enemies treated them more humanely than the U.S. Army, and some defected to Mexico. Some of the defectors were captured and hanged. Others were hidden by Mexican citizens. Their descendants live in northern Mexico today. Texas ceded territory to the United States in exchange for the federal government assuming the $10 million war debt of the Lone Star Republic. Now, New Mexico and parts of other states were United States territories. Latinos in Texas and the Southwest never crossed the border to become U.S. citizens. The border crossed them. In New Mexico, Colonel Stephen Kearny was tasked with seeing to the transfer of government in New Mexico. When he marched his troops into the territory, he informed citizens of the change. There was surprisingly little resistance. The Mexican flag came down in the capital of Santa Fe, and the American flag was raised up. With so little apparent resistance, Kearny appointed Trader Charles Bent to be the governor, and Kearny led his troops away into California. Charles Bent had strong ties with Native Americans in New Mexico. He was considered a friend of the Cheyenne and the Pueblo people. Secure in his standing with Mexican leaders and with Native Americans alike, Governor Bent left Santa Fe to be at his home in Taos. Rebellion flared up by Mexican and Pueblo leaders. Their plot to kill collaborators with the United States stalled, but several Pueblo scalped, killed, and dismembered Charles Bent in front of his horrified family. That rebellion was put down and its leaders hanged. Again, the flag of the United States flew in Santa Fe. The Apaches were some of the first Native Americans to adopt the horse culture. They lived in different bands, but their lives all revolved around bison. The horse made them much more effective hunters of bison, or buffalo. Many bands had friendly relations with the Pueblos, whom they regarded as valued trade partners. Spanish missions reduced the Pueblos to servitude, leaving them very little time to produce the clothing and other items they traded with the Apaches. Soon, trading turned to raiding, an activity in which the Apaches were successful. As their raids increased, they made enemies of the surrounding tribes. So the Comanches pushed the Apaches out of much of Texas fairly quickly, with help from their neighbors. Many Apaches moved west, while others raided the Spanish at San Antonio. By the time that the United States controlled the region, Apaches raided into Mexico. When the United States signed treaties with Mexico, the U.S. agreed to stop the Apache raids, an example of foreign entanglements that George Washington warned against. Early experiences with the United States were positive for the Apache. Colonel Kearny made friendly contact with the Apaches, and they were glad to see enemies of the Mexicans. Apache leaders agreed to let the United States Army use Apache Pass in their invasion of Mexico. The Apaches had experience with Europeans since the time of Coronado. At times, one band or another would agree to peace with the Spaniards, while another raided them. There was an on-again, off-again war with the Spaniards and later with the Mexicans, but mostly these were in the form of raids. The Apaches suffered raids as well. At the conclusion of the U.S. war with Mexico, the Apaches signed a peace treaty with the United States, recognizing the U.S. as conquerors of Mexico. This began good relations between Apaches and settlers from the United States. With the ceding of California, Mexico lost over a third of their territory, leaving the entire Southwest under sovereignty of the United States. The Pawnee people lived for centuries at the eastern edge of the Great Plains. These speakers of the Caddoan language built settlements near rivers and creeks, farming the fertile land near streams. They lived in large cone-shaped dwellings. The roof was strong enough to hold the weight of several people. The Pawnee celebrated rituals that involved the entire community. Their culture and language was largely distinct from that of their neighbors. Their social organization mirrored that of the Caddo people, a highly stratified system of inherited power. They also ventured out on the plains after harvest season to hunt bison, which they first did without horses. The hunt changed when they obtained horses, and they spent more of their time in the hunt. A very important ceremony to the Pawnees was the Morning Star ritual, which involved human sacrifice. The victim was usually a captive. Since the days of New France, the Pawnee suffered constant raids for slaves. The name Pawnee comes from a French term meaning slave. The Pawnee were surrounded by people with different languages and different customs. They maintained their territory pretty well until tribes were pushed west from the other side of the Mississippi River. The Pawnee had a close alliance with the Kiowa. As the Cheyenne, Sioux, Arapaho, and others moved on to the Great Plains, the Pawnee found themselves surrounded by hostile and aggressive tribes. Pawnee warriors were no lightweight fighters when it came to protecting their country, but simultaneous attacks from all directions proved disastrous for the Pawnee. An entire hunting party was wiped out by Lakota Sioux warriors, and parts of their homeland were encroached upon by these newer tribes. The Pawnee were early signers of treaties with the United States, the first as early as 1818. They ceded land in what became Oklahoma and elsewhere, hoping for protection from invaders. An unrelated group that was also surrounded by hostile tribes was the Crow. The Crow had once lived near Lake Erie in Ohio. They were pushed west by better armed and more aggressive people. At one point, they separated from the Hidatsa and moved even further west. The westward movement of the Cheyenne and the Sioux forced the Crow westward again, overtaking territory from the Shoshone in today's Montana. The Crow split off from the Hidatsa and moved west to embrace a nomadic life in the Great Plains. The Crow quickly adopted the horse culture, allowing them to thrive on this part of the Great Plains, ranging from the Yellowstone area north to the Musselshell River, then northeast to the Yellowstone's mouth at the Missouri River, and southeast to the confluence of the Yellowstone and Powder Rivers. The Crow allied with the Kiowa and Plains Apache, but did not move south with them. Like all Plains tribes, the Crows live by hunting bison. The Crows celebrated the sun dance and included a doll figure as powerful medicine. One such figure was given to the Kiowa people, which they considered their most important source of spiritual power. Once they settled in the Yellowstone Valley, the Crow divided into 4 bands: the Mountain Crow, the River Crow, the Kicked-in-the-Bellies, and the Beaver dries its fur. They were often at war with the Cheyenne. The Crow became notable breeders and traders of horses, but as horse-poor tribes moved through the Great Plains, the Crows suffered raids on their herds. The raids escalated when Blackfoot Confederacy, Gros Ventre, Assiniboine, Pawnee, and Ute hit them from all sides, and soon they had to face the Lakota and their allies, the Arapaho and Cheyenne. So soon the Crow were surrounded by enemies. A vision by Chief Plenty Coues, when he was only 10 years old, urged the Crows to seek and keep good relations with the United States. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851 confirmed much of the Crow territory, including the Yellowstone Valley and the Powder River area, including the Bighorn Mountains. But the Sioux encroached on Crow land, taking over part of the Powder River Basin. When the U.S. Army began building forts along the Bozeman Trail, Crows helped the garrisons. The Kiowa lived near the center of the Great Plains, where they lived peacefully along the Crow tribe. As a result of the Ojibwa expansion, the Cheyenne pushed westward, edging the Kiowa south. Then the Sioux pushed the Cheyenne out of the Black Hills and pushed the Kiowa east. They spread into the Great Plains of eastern Colorado, Oklahoma, and on to the Llano Estacado, and even northeastern New Mexico. The Kiowa made allies of the Comanche and Plains Apache, which expanded their reach and control. This alliance kept the Spanish from controlling the southern plains through constant raids and occasional warfare. More frequent warfare was with the Osage and Pawnee. Added to that was war with the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Sioux. The young, fearless warrior was the role model for Kiowa boys. The Kiowa were pushed into their southern territory by expansion of the Cheyenne. Nonetheless, they eventually allied themselves with the Cheyenne. The result was wartime cooperation between the Kiowa, Comanche, Cheyenne, and Arapaho. These new allies joined the Kiowa in long-distance raids into Mexico, mostly for horses and livestock. The Kiowa had always found a way to thrive on the Great Plains. The horse made living on the plains easier, and hence made the Kiowa more successful. Along with bison, the Kiowa hunted other game, including pronghorns. The Kiowa ranged far and wide in hunting and raiding parties. Whole communities were on the move. The Kiowa traded with the Wichita south along the Red River, and with the Mescalero Apache and New Mexicans to the southwest. The Kiowa had at one time lived in the Black Hills. Although they had been pushed out many years ago, they still hold this river valley sacred to this day. The Nez Perce were not newcomers to the Columbia River Plateau. They lived there over 12,000 years. They had made many friends in that time, including with the Crows. The Nez Perce greeted the first salmon run of the year with ceremony, honoring the swimmers in hopes of their annual return. To the east, some Nez Perce would meet up with their Crow allies on the Great Plains to hunt bison. These would include joyful reunions with friends, daring hunts, and raids on enemies. The Crow shared the appreciation for horses and shared the results of careful breeding, resulting in the Appaloosa horse. For the Crow and the Nez Perce, horses were treasured possessions. These hunting expeditions could include up to 1,000 Indians moving on to the plains from the Columbia Plateau. Along with the Nez Perce were their neighbors, the Cayuse. Back home, some bands of the Nez Perce hosted missionaries. Emissaries had traveled all the way to St. Louis to seek the medicine that brought such power and prosperity to the Lewis and Clark expedition. Missionary Henry Spalding laid down stern rules and insisted that the Nez Perce give up their semi-nomadic life. Very few embraced this coercion. To their west, the Cayuse allowed missionaries Marcus and Narcissa Whitman to build a mission on Cayuse land. Like the Nez Perce, the Cayuse put a premium on horses, developing the Cayuse pony. This advanced their success as warriors and raiders. As more Oregon Trail immigrants came through the Whitman mission, the Cayuse became concerned that the mission was for the benefit of the immigrants rather than the Cayuse. Sick pioneers sought the help of Marcus Whitman, who was a doctor. When an epidemic of measles began spreading, Dr. Whitman ministered to immigrants and Cayuse alike. However, while the immigrants often recovered, Cayuse children were dying. Convinced that the Whitmans were poisoning them, the Cayuse killed the Whitmans and others at the mission. Soldiers under the command of Washington Governor Stevens pursued the Cayuse, killing many who were not involved in the killing of the missionaries, eventually capturing the leaders of the Whitman massacre, and they were hanged. Governor Stevens issued a proclamation establishing martial law. Even some white settlers who had married Native Americans were arrested, suspected of having mixed loyalties. The Cayuse War resulted in unrest throughout the Pacific Northwest inland tribes and those near Puget Sound. The Battle of Seattle and the Yakima Campaign resulted in numerous skirmishes and battles, often with killing of settlers and Native American communities that had nothing to do with the war. The 1850s saw efforts to exterminate many groups of Native Americans at the hands of miners and settlers. Survivors of genocide were forced onto reservations, often in ecosystems with which they had no experience, and often thrown together on reservations with their traditional enemies. Hunger and exposure were common experiences. The troubles in the Northwest were not a major focus of the United States. The country was polarized by the issue of slavery. Most northern states had eliminated slavery soon after independence, but southern states had codified slavery of African slaves. While the South tried to preserve and expand slavery, abolitionists worked to end it. When Abraham Lincoln was elected president, years of compromise collapsed. Southern states pulled out of the Union, including Texas, despite impassioned pleas by Sam Houston to stay in. When Fort Sumter was attacked by South Carolina, the war was on. Recruiters from both the Union and the South sought support from Native Americans. This divided the Cherokee. Some Cherokee supporters of the North had to relocate to Kansas to escape violence from Cherokees fighting for the South. Stand Watie fought for the Confederates and earned the rank of Brigadier General. He was the last to stand down after Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Grant. An 1851 treaty ceded a huge area of Sioux land to the United States and began the reservation era for 4 bands of the Sioux. In 1862, a crop failure and the late arrival of food from the United States reduced the Sioux in Minnesota to starvation. After decades of broken promises, trickery, and audacious corruption, the Dakota Sioux in Minnesota were out of options. Desperate and angry, Sioux warriors took action. One after another, white settlers were attacked and killed. More Sioux warriors joined in, and more farms were attacked and settlers killed. Settlers fought back, and those who could sought safety at forts and blockhouses. At Wood Lake, the Sioux who rose up were defeated by soldiers, and this is where most of the violence ended. Sioux warriors surrendered at Camp Release, where captured settlers were returned and fighters awaited their fate. Some fled to Canada with war leader Little Crows. Little Crows soon returned to Minnesota, where he was killed by a settler who collected a bounty. Little Crow's head was put on display in St. Paul. The Sioux Indian War was a nightmare for white settlers, many of them traumatized by witnessing the killing of family members and the destruction of their farms. Later in 1862, courts-martial found 303 Dakota Sioux guilty of murder and rape. With no attorneys and no witnesses allowed to testify, they were sentenced to hang. President Lincoln commuted the sentences of all but 38. The others were forced into prison, where most died. Most Dakota Sioux had refused to join the uprising, but the reservations were closed to all Sioux, and all treaty payments stopped, and soon there were virtually no Sioux remaining in Minnesota. Good Thunder and Sarah later returned to live out the rest of their days in Minnesota. They had no Sioux neighbors. White settlers continued to pour in to Minnesota.
Oh, we are way, oh, we are, oh, we are, we are, we, oh, we are, oh, we are,